Hey guys, this is Luke Humphrey. Welcome back to the Luke Humphrey Running Podcast, and I hope you enjoyed the first marathon series. It was fun to put together for me, and a great way to revisit what we'd put in the book. But hopefully, it sheds some light on some things for those looking to run a marathon for the first time. And I even got from our Facebook group and things like that. I got a lot of positive feedback as well from just revisiting some basics that we sometimes forget. So thank you for those who reached out and hopefully looking at the downloads, it looks like quite a few of you have utilized that. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And today I'm gonna the first marathon series was easy because I had basically ready material to get ready to go. As we get into spring marathon season's coming around, so I don't know if I'll be able to do a podcast every week, but my goal is to definitely do one at least every other week. It depends on how many schedules are written and all that good stuff. But I enjoy it, and I look forward to putting more topics into further discussion for you. So today I'm going to kind of expand on something that we touched on in the first marathon series, and that's increasing mileage. And I really want to go into the 10% rule a little bit more, especially because I got an email from a gentleman who bought the book, the Hanson's First Marathon. He was very concerned that the book did not follow the 10% rule, and I have in air quotes 10% rule because it's one of those things where I don't who even came up with a 10% rule. I don't know. And I actually did a Dr. Google search and couldn't really come up with anything either. And it's funny how things work out that way because you'll hear Kevin and Keith tell their story about how the 20 miler and things like that. And I actually did my master's thesis on 220 minus your age for heart rate. And there's a few hundred pages of research there that I wrote out that nobody ever really, it was just kind of an arbitrary number. And sometimes you get that, and I understand that because you get coaches who they don't know why, they just know that it works. And obviously if you keep somebody at a low enough level, you're probably not going to get them hurt. So 10% is an easy number, right? You can just say don't increase your mileage by 10%, you won't get hurt. And that may be true. That's probably true for a lot of people. But so I really wanted to look at, from a research standpoint, where the 10% rule stacks up, and more importantly, from a practical standpoint. And so I want to jump into that. So, and luckily, I found an article that really did a lot of the work for me, which is always nice. So this article appeared in the International Journal of Sports Physical Therapy in December of 2018, and it's a meta-analysis. So most of you probably know what a meta-analysis is, but it's basically just a culmination of all the research that was ever done, and they try to take a look at it. And then they sort out based on certain criteria. So they were looking at, they only wanted to look at articles involving running-related injury as a result of training load, and we'll get into what actual training load is in a little bit. They were randomized trials and included ages 18 to 65, and they used runners as subjects. And what's amazing to me is that they began with a database of over 8,200 research studies, and by the time they were screened for the eligibility, only 4 studies actually met the criteria. So what this immediately tells us is that the subject really hasn't been looked at over a fairly long period of time, probably 30, 40 years. At least through sound scientific principles, and so you have to do that because randomized trials is really the gold standard for any study. You want it to be randomized. Even the training load itself, I mean, that can mean a lot of things. That could be mileage, that could mean intensity, that could mean adding frequency. Like what variables are you adding to increase the training load? So even that's a little bit deceptive there. And then using runners as subjects, because a lot of times you'll see a lot of military-based studies, and the reason why they do is because they can get a lot of subjects, right? And they can look at different things based on having a large number of people. But sometimes, if a lot of people in the military aren't runners, they do running in basic training and through their PE and things like that. And I've coached a lot of runners who are active military, and that's part of what they do, but they're not necessarily runners per se. So you really have to be careful with what you're looking at. And so that really does that really begged to me the question, why did we settle on 10%? And I honestly don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think that's the big mystery. And just, it's really just one of those things where along the line, somebody thought it was a good idea, made an assessment of it, and it's stuck over time. And that's, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just where actually did that come from? So that's really what I want to look at. And so then moving on. So as far as what did make the criteria, what does the data actually say? And unfortunately, even with the 4 studies that made the cut, there remain issues. So mainly the lack of the definition of a sudden increase in training rate. So what was the actual definition of sudden increase? Was it from 1 week to the next, 1 day to the next, rolling average? There's a lot of things you have to really decide on there. There wasn't really continuity, and that's what you find with a lot of problems with research is, the whole idea of doing a research study is to make it duplicatable. Yeah, that's a word, right? So you can duplicate it time and time again, and if it's sound, if you do the same duplication, you should get the same results over and over again, right? So if you don't have something that's really that you can replicate, then people are kind of doing their own thing, and then things get, you're going to be having all these different results when they're trying to look at the exact same things, and so it's really kind of hard to discern what actually is and what isn't. So that's part of the problem. And then with only 4 studies, then we start running into problems, right? So that's really part of the problem. The same thing with nutrition. There's so much different definitions of the same thing that you run into problems. So with any case, let's talk about this. So that was the big problem there. The definition of increase in training was a big one. But in the all 4 studies showed that injuries increased with mileage, but failed to define the increase. In the 4th article, though, so the last article that they looked at that met the criteria, 3 groups were looked at, and I think this is kind of where we're basing our decisions off here. They looked at a group that stayed within a 10% increase in training, a second group that was 10 to 29% increase in training, and a last group was 30% increase in training. The biggest takeaway is that the 30% by far and away had higher injury rates, and that's no big surprise to anybody, right? That you have to keep things in balance, right? You can't just jack your training up and expect things to go well for long periods of time. So the back end of that, though, is that the differences there was really no difference in rate of injury between the 10% group and then the 10 to 29% group. Those 2 groups essentially had the same rate of injury. So if you were going to increase your mileage by 10%, you were probably going to get the chance of getting an injury was the same as somebody who was essentially increasing their training by 25%. So you really saw no increase in possibility of getting injured. So that there tells us another thing too, that we don't necessarily have to stick to that such a low volume of training. But I think you have to look at that a little bit more too. So I think the things you have to take out of this is, one, there doesn't need to be, but there should be some more research on this area to really get some definition and some clarity. The second thing I would take from that is that if you're considering mileage as a source of training load increase, which I'll get into a little bit later, the smaller relative increases may not have any more impact on injury rate as more moderate increases of volume. And so from a practical standpoint, I say that there are a few factors to consider when deciding how much to increase your mileage, right? So the first factor is where you currently are with your running. So believe it or not, a lower mileage runner can probably be a little more aggressive in terms of percentage increase. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. And I touched on this in the one podcast we did for first marathon. So I'm using a baseline of 10 miles per week. So let's see what an average runner starts out at, right? A newbie starts out about 10 miles a week. That's essentially 3 times a week, 3 miles a run. So a 10% increase, the first week you increase your mileage, that first week would be 11 miles. To get to 20 miles would take you 8 weeks. So 2 months just to go from 10 to 20 miles per week. 20% increase to get to 20 miles a week would take you 4 weeks. And if you did a 25% increase, it would take you still roughly 3 to 4 weeks to get to 20 miles per week. All right, so by that chart, you see that using a starting point of 10 miles per week is the starting baseline. If in this example, we are using this for a new runner, and we're not looking at, we're only using a new runner, we're only looking at running volume. We're not talking about adding workouts, adding, that's the big thing. Now, we're not talking about adding workouts. We're controlling simply for volume. And I'm excluding other variables like intensity for now. If you start at 10 miles per week and increase mileage by 10% per week, it would take you 2 months to build to 20 miles per week. On the flip side, if you believe the research is what the research is indicating, and increase by 20% per week, you can knock that time in half. If I'll increase this more in a second, I'll discuss this more in a second, but let's discuss the 25% column. You can see at week 4, you are almost the same as a 20%. It's 20.74 versus 22.5. At week 4. However, after that, you really start increasing the mileage. And this is more of a relative term. So you go from 22 to 28 to 35 to 43 to 55. So in 2 months, going from 10 miles a week to 55 miles a week is a substantial stretch, right? Like as a coach, I don't particularly feel comfortable with doing that with a person. And that's simply just on mileage too. And there's other factors too. If I were doing workouts too, there's no way I would jump up that fast. But to get to where we want to be, I think 20%, 20 to 25% is a good start. And we'll get to that. I think to get to that sweet spot of 20 to 25 miles a week, and this I'm talking about a new runner, right? So I feel like if you can get a newer runner to 20 to 25 miles a week, you really open the doors for a lot of stuff. So moving on from that, why do I need to increase that fast? Won't I get hurt? Why am I referencing 4 weeks? Why is 20 to 25 miles a week important? These are all questions that I found myself asking while writing this, and I assume that you are asking something similar. So part of the answers to these involve the research, and while the others involves just my observations from coaching folks. 4 weeks appears to be a good amount of time to build just your mileage. I'm not talking about doing workouts or anything like that. Just building your mileage and adding some other source of training load increase. So we get to, basically what I'm saying is we get to 4 weeks on mileage, then we can essentially either stay at that mileage or back way off on the amount that we're increasing and slowly add the other variables in. And so we're still increasing training load, but we're scaling back the one variable to make sure that we can safely add another variable. Because if we add too many variables at one time, that's when we get hurt. And we can do that in 4 weeks and not significantly increase the risk of developing a running-related injury based on what I've seen as a coach and based on what the research is also telling us. I can get a runner to focus on just adding mileage while keeping intensity low and not take forever to do it. Then I can allow them to jump into a training program. So maybe the beginner marathon program, or then they can open up the door if they want to do 5Ks and 10Ks. The possibilities of where you can go from that 20 to 25 miles a week are, you can basically do anything. You can do anything you want from that standpoint. If you're marathon training, it allows us to add slower intensity and longer run while scaling back the rate at which we are increasing the volume of training. By slower intensity, I'm just taking that next step up the intensity ladder, right? I'm not talking about adding just speed work. I'm talking about mainly adding marathon pace work. For a lot of people, that's the next logical step, right? We're just going to go from easy running and moderate pace running into then adding the next step, which would be marathon pace running. And all this time, we are still gaining fitness, but we're also adjusting the variables at which we increase. So maybe we use a 20 to 25% increase for the first 4 weeks. We get to that 20 to 25 miles a week. If we're going to start adding marathon pace workouts, then that's the other variable we're adding, right? So we'll scale back the amount we increase. Maybe we scale that back down to 15 or 10% increases in overall volume and slowly add the marathon pace. And maybe a little bit longer long run. So then we can just start shifting things around a little bit without focusing on one thing. So that is why I think that 4 weeks is a good starting point for you. All right. So now everything we've talked about so far was to get a runner from initial lower mileage to a solid base and then start structured training. So your initial focus was simply more mileage at easier paces, then allowing a shift away from adding mileage as fast but insert more intensity. Once we got to a level of about 30 miles a week, I don't think you can continue to add mileage at that 20 to 25%. It's almost kind of a reverse scale. Now we really start scaling back the amount we can actually increase our volume, because in percentage wise, it's still not a huge percentage, but in absolute numbers, now it's becoming much, much bigger, right? So I actually made another chart. So if you get to 30 miles a week, you add 10%, it's 3 miles the next week, or 15%, it's 4.5 miles a week. At 20%, it's 6 miles a week. So you add 20% onto a 30-mile week, that's a 6-mile run. Where's that 6 miles going to come from? And that's really kind of the stretching point at 30 miles a week, I would put. At 40 miles, it'd be like 15% would be a 6-mile increase. At 50 miles, a 10% would be 5 miles, and at 60 miles a week, 6 miles would be a 10% increase. And then after that, you really want to be cautious, right? So anything above that, you really want to be careful. So let's just use an example. If you're running 40 miles a week and you go up by 25%, that's 10 miles a week. That's a relatively big number in absolute terms. And if you go 30%, that's 12 miles. That's like adding a whole nother long run onto your week, right? So then we have to start really being careful about the percentage that we're increasing and start looking more at the absolute number that we're adding. Because for a lot of you get to 40, 50 miles a week and you add 10%, which is 4 and 5 miles, that's almost adding another run to your week, right? So where are we going to fit that in? And so think about it this way. At lower mileage, you have a lot more room to wiggle room. You may be able to add another day for a couple of the increases. So if you're starting out like 3 days a week, you might be able to build to 4, build to 5, maybe build to 6. You have those options there. Then you can start increasing your longer run on the weekend, and then a miler here during the weekday, and you have places to put that extra mileage. But you're eventually going to get to a point is where am I going to put that mileage? So then it really becomes you have to be careful too. And then I would say, and I don't really talk about it much in what I wrote out, but then I think you kind of shift away from just adding mileage, and you start putting your focus into maybe other things. So to summarize, when starting at a low weekly volume, take 4 to 6 weeks and add volume through easy running rate at 15 to 25% per week. Then back the rate of increasing volume off and allow for the addition of intensity along with gradual increases in daily volume and frequency of runs. So up until now, all the discussion has been centered around the first time getting to a weekly volume. However, what if you're coming off planned downtime, say post-race? I don't put injury in this category because I think you have to handle that differently. That's a different topic. Or what if you were training at a lower volume, say for a shorter race, say you did a 5K 10 segment, and then you're going to jump back into a marathon segment. How do we get back into that higher mileage? So overall, the general theory is about the same for my athletes. As long as the volume is something you were able to tolerate previously, then you can certainly be more aggressive than the 10% increase per week. My general rule of thumb is that the first week of running is about 50% of the desired weekly mileage. So if you're wanting to get up to 50 miles a week, we start out at 25 miles per week. The second week would be an increase of 25%. So that in our example there would be up to about 31 miles per week. The third week could be a 20% increase, which should take you to 37.5 miles per week. The fourth week would be a 10% increase, and that would take you to 41 miles per week. At this point, you're about 80% of the peak volume that you're going to get to, right? So I know there's a lot of percentages there, but so basically taking 4 weeks to get to 80% of the peak volume that you want to get to. Because remember, at this point, you're going to have at least, depending on who you are and where you're at with training, you're going to have anywhere from 8 weeks to 18 weeks beyond this that you're going to train. So we can, even if we increase like 5% a week, you'd still probably get up to that peak mileage for a number of weeks. But if we go at that peak mileage too soon, and we're at that peak mileage for 12, 14 weeks and doing workouts, that's a recipe for getting overcooked. So you really have to balance everything out. So that's a summary of what I would do for a marathon. But if you're coming off of a shorter race like a 5K or a 10K, then you can probably get away with 2 or 3 week build up and then start workouts that third or fourth week back, because you went from doing a lot of intensity, take a short break, and maybe that's even just active rest. Maybe that's just a week of easy running at lower mileage, and then you jump into your build up for the marathon again. Granted, this is all dependent on the fact that you are healthy or the source of the problem has been addressed. So if you do have a problem, it's taken care of, you're not injured, you're not starting the training cycle injured, anything like that. All right, so to me, the biggest takeaways is that there's not a lot of research to show that 10% should be a hard and fast rule when increasing your mileage. Like a lot of items in training, it is dependent on your individual factors. It's also more about relative percentage that makes the most sense. A 30% increase at 10 miles a week is a lot more reasonable than a 30% increase at 50 miles per week because of the absolute numbers that you're adding on to that. And lastly, I feel like we have had much more success when focusing on mileage first in low intensities before slowing the rate of volume increases to accommodate more intensity. Granted, if you know you are more injury prone, then maybe focus on becoming more resilient before trying to make big jumps, or explore common themes of why you're becoming injured. I'll use a personal example of this. I had a gentleman email me, and this was a number of years ago, and he was hurt all the time. And so I looked at his log, and I looked at it for months, and I think even a couple of years, and he had the same thing. Was he jumped up everything so quick. Like he would go 0 to 60 in like 2 weeks. He'd be doing workouts, full tilt, and then he'd be hurt. In 4 to 6 weeks, he'd be hurt. And he did this time and time and time and time again. I mean, literally over and over again. And so he wanted to hire me. And so I go, okay, well, this is what we need to do. We need to slow down how fast you're building up. I said, and then for him, I did say, I said, you need to go to like a 10% rule or something like that, because you are just going so fast on everything that you're doing that your body just cannot keep up with it. Your body's breaking down because you're throwing so much at it at one time, it simply can't handle it. So we need to control some of these variables. He got so mad. And he's like, I will not do that. I am not. And they hired me, which was probably better for both of us. But it was like, look at those things. Look, that's one of the reasons why we keep a training log, right? That's why, not just to post on Strava, but to look at it, right? If something continually happens, why is it happening? And so we can look at that. We can look at our training and look at and see those things. So just keep that in mind when you're doing that, because it could save you. It could save you a lot of hassle by seeing where the trouble's coming from and then fixing it, And so just keep that in mind. But, at the end of the day, 10% might be fine, but it's all relative to where you're at and what your situation is. And I think we've covered a lot of that in here. And hopefully that will help a lot of you, get out of the mindset where it has to be this just painstakingly gradual increase to get to a certain amount of mileage. And sometimes we get too aggressive, but on the other hand, we get too conservative sometimes too. So hopefully this will kind of help you keep things in balance, keep things moving along, and doing what you really want to do is train at a higher level and racing at a higher level. So hopefully that helps. As always, thanks for listening, guys. And I'll talk to you later. All right. Have a good one.